Hello, I'm 𝘮𝘪𝘮𝘮𝘮 from the London School of Economics, and I'm here with my former colleague Jo Ganderson, now of the University of Milan. For the last several years, we've both been part of a research project called 𝘮𝘪𝘮, which has looked at the European Union since 2008. We looked at a string of crises in that period, from the euro area crisis of the early 2010s, through a refugee crisis in 2015, Brexit in 2016, the COVID pandemic, and in the background, an ongoing social crisis of unemployment. We're going to look at one of those crises in particular today, Brexit, and talk about the project's research findings in that area. Jo, welcome back to the LSE.
Hello, Kate.
So Brexit was the first major act of disintegration for the European Union, the first time a member state had left. It's a really significant moment. And our research has looked at whether that has been weakening for the EU, or perhaps in some ways even made it stronger. Jo, when the UK voted to leave in 2016, was that seen as a serious moment for the EU and as a crisis for Europe, or mostly as a British crisis?
Well, the UK was always an outlying European member state in some ways. It was known to be quite sceptical about European integration and ever greater European integration. But there were lots of cataclysmic predictions about the immediate effects of a vote for Brexit that didn't come to pass. So, the UK didn't fall off the edge of the cliff in June 2016. And the historical context of the Brexit vote was a really tumultuous time for the EU. It was coming off the back of two other crises that you just mentioned that were particularly bruising, polarizing crises for the EU, the Eurozone crisis and the refugee crisis that really pitched member states against other member states. But unlike those two crises, Brexit was really not prompted by an external shock, be that economic or migratory, right? It was really about one member state trying to relitigate its relationship with the EU and a real rejection of its relationship with the EU and deciding to go it alone. So for the EU at that point in time, of course, there was the material impact of the UK voting to leave, which was significant, the third largest member state or second largest member state by GDP, one of two major military powers, a large net budget contributor. But more importantly than that, there was the politics of the domino effect that the EU was concerned would happen from there. So different Eurosceptic politicians gaining ground around the continent and trying to renegotiate their own terms of membership with the EU, either wholesale following the UK out, holding referendums of their own, or simply trying to go back to the table with the EU and get bespoke membership terms, as David Cameron had tried to do in early 2016. So there's a real danger of a domino effect and of precedent setting in the politics of Brexit for the EU.
So how did the EU respond in order to manage this crisis?
Our researchers looked at a few ways that the EU has responded. Of course, there was a protracted negotiations period, and this was really critical in terms of addressing the potential domino effect threat that I mentioned before. So the negotiations had to be handled successfully from the EU's perspective for those people within the EU that wanted to ward off disintegration or a feeding frenzy of beggar thy neighbour approaches from member states. So we looked at, for example, the history of Article 50, because there are some institutional aspects of the EU which are quite strange, quite counterintuitive, but give it certain advantages and robustness. So the Article 50 was devised in the early 2000s, really to ward off Eurosceptic fears that the EU was a prison, but it also gave the European Commission and the European Council key controls over the way negotiations would be handled. Of course, it set the 2-year timeline as well. So it gave the EU certain advantages a priori going into the negotiations. But in terms of the politics of those negotiations, and they really weren't foreordained, it wasn't clear how they were going to play out. But the EU did manage to mobilize loyalty quite quickly. The Euro institutions we found in our research into the negotiations managed to work together quite effectively. There was no real rivalry between the Council and the Commission, and this was a potential danger for the EU. They managed to work together to quickly mobilize Michel Barnier's negotiating task force and to get member states on side. Our research into the politics of the negotiations and Brexit looked at key countries and how Brexit was discussed and how much it was discussed in those countries. So we looked at Ireland, France, Germany, and Spain and Poland, for example, and we found that really Brexit just wasn't the salient polarizing issue in those countries that it was actually in the UK after the referendum vote. And this allowed the leaders of those countries to really go to the table and to really line up a single EU negotiating perspective that gave it strength and unity in the negotiations with the UK when they were particularly protracted and over the years. So this allowed the Commission-led 𝘱𝘵 task force real autonomy, really to hold to the EU's red lines of protecting the EU's core interests and core raisons d'être, as it were, the single market and the customs union, which are really under threat by the negotiating position of the UK. So the EU was able to show a consistent level of unity that was perhaps unexpected by some of the negotiators in the UK when they were devising the British strategy.
And that low salience of Brexit for those other European publics, that helped their leaders in the negotiations?
Yes, it helped Brexit to stay on a relatively low simmer in those national countries. Even in Ireland we found that that was the case. It allowed a certain level of autonomy in the international negotiations and for Brussels to articulate a pan-European position, as it were, in defiance of the UK's attempts to kind of play divide and rule a little bit with the other member states and to pick off bilateral relationships with the other member states.
So Joe, you mentioned that the EU initially feared a domino effect in which Brexit emboldened Eurosceptic parties elsewhere in the continent and potentially saw other countries following suit. But we now know that hasn't happened. What does the research tell us about why that hasn't happened?
Well, in our special issue on Brexit as a membership crisis that wasn't in the Journal of European Public Policy, we have several papers looking at this. And I think there are really two ways to look at this. The first one is to look at it from a comparative point of view. So to take every member state and its relationship with the EU as a kind of contained objective analysis, right? And what we did there, some of our colleagues looked at centre-right parties. We know that centre-right parties, and certainly the Conservatives, were key instigators in Brexit, gatekeepers, as it were, for the UK's relationship with the EU. They looked at manifesto data over a number of decades across centre-right and Christian democratic parties in the EU to compare how Eurosceptic they are with the British Conservatives. And they really found that there is no party that comes close to the British Conservatives, both in terms of how much they talk about Europe and had historically talked about Europe, and how hostile they were to European integration. So comparatively, and treating each member state on its own is one way to look at the potential for other exits or other renegotiations, and we really don't find the British Eurosceptic party tradition on the centre-right present in any other member state. A second way to look at this is to look at the more radical Eurosceptic parties and challengers to European Union membership. So these were the parties that really greeted Brexit with outright enthusiasm and often called for copycat referendums in their own countries. So we saw this in the Netherlands, in France, in Italy, several prominent member states. Looking at Twitter data from leaders and the accounts of these parties after the referendum in 2016, we find that their enthusiasm for Brexit and copycatting Brexit, talking about it, really tapers off over time. They start to moderate the way they talk about Brexit and their positions on the issue.
Okay, so we know that the EU achieved a pretty good degree of unity through the negotiating process, and we know that the feared domino effect doesn't seem to have happened. Does that mean that the threat of disintegration has now really receded for the EU, or does it maybe manifest in different ways now?
Yeah, I think the latter. I think that there are certainly Eurosceptic threats to the European integration regime and engine, as it were, but the Brexit type threat doesn't seem as prominent as it was back in 2016 to be potentially copied by other member states. We're starting in our research to think about Brexit as a kind of membership crisis, as a kind of leading example of a genre of internal crisis, about how member states interact with the EU and how that really might have a larger effect on whether the EU continues to integrate or disintegrates or deintegrates and spills powers back to member states. So what we think is happening now is that Brexit is a kind of example that's prompting other member states to think differently about how they channel their criticism of Europe towards the centre. Not opting for the kind of nuclear option of exit at the moment, but thinking about challenging the kind of polity model, the way the European polity is progressing, and proposing different ways of thinking about this. So the rule of law crisis is a clear example of this, a so-called rule of law crisis, and Hungary is the most prominent state there. And Viktor Orbán has been very explicit about the different ways he wants the European Union to work in the interests of member states. So this is a very different type of challenge or threat to the EU's integration regime than Brexit, but nonetheless, it is a kind of membership crisis of its own. So there are new challenges that the EU is facing now.
So looking back now, 10 years or almost 10 years on from the UK referendum, was this the crisis from the European perspective, or was it perhaps not a crisis at all?
Yeah, it depends how you measure it, really. I think in a material sense, we can say it was undeniably a moment of shock, of disintegration, of crisis for the EU, because it was the first member state leaving, but not just any member state, as we said. And materially, the EU is diminished by Brexit. It has less influence on the world stage. And we're seeing in contemporary politics now how that weight on the world stage could be important for the EU going forward, and how its relationship with the UK remains open-ended and very important. But we think politically it was a crisis of affirmation for the EU, right? So it could have gone either way, but we think that actually it was a good crisis politically for the EU in that sense, because it really reminded and focused other member states outside of the UK what the EU is for and the kind of benefits that they get from European integration. Now, of course, Brexit is a living project. It's a living experiment in what it's like to leave the EU. Now, all the indicators to date suggest that it's a kind of salutary tale, a cautionary tale for those who want to leave the EU. As we say, it's moderated some of the harder Eurosceptics on the continent and forced them to rethink their relationship with the EU rather than reject it. But just because Brexit is seen as a cautionary tale now, that doesn't mean that it will stay like that forever, of course. The two polities, the UK and Europe, are moving in sequence, and it may be that at a certain point the UK's decision to leave the EU appears like a more positive decision or a more favourable decision for other member states to follow. What we know at the moment, and what our research shows us, is that that hasn't really been the case in the near decade since the vote. So what Brexit really shows us, in summary, is that the EU has certain features that really allow it to mobilise loyalty in a crisis and to move and react in a kind of improvised manner that allows it to muddle through relatively successfully. There are certain institutional adaptations, for example, Article 50 in the negotiating process, that allow the EU control, even when it appears to be destabilised. So the lesson from Brexit, I think, is that though the EU was buffeted and destabilised seriously back in 2016 and beyond, it has been a kind of crisis of affirmation, and it has revealed, as has some other events of the past decade, some of the surprising strengths of the EU as a developing polity in its own right.
Jo Ganderson, thank you very much. So we'd be interested to know what you think of this crisis. Was Brexit destabilising for Europe, or was it in some ways a good crisis for the EU that revealed some of its surprising resilience through turbulent times? You can respond to this video below. You can also check out our website for more research papers on the topic and our Blue Sky account. Thank you.